In this video I'm going to explore the locations and other facts regarding the 1972 death of Dr. Duncan in Adelaide, South Australia. Now, I have already made a previous video on Dr. Duncan's drowning. That was on the 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, but this is an updated and improved version of that. I have a lot more information, a lot more exact locations to show, so that's why I'm doing a second video, and I consider this the more complete video. This is possible because of the release of a recent book in 2022 called The Death of Dr. Duncan by author Tim Reeves, which contains a treasure trove of information that I found extremely useful. So if anyone's interested in the Dr. Duncan case, I urge them to read that excellent book. Now, just a bit of background information on Dr. Duncan before we get to the actual murder of the man. He was born George Ian Ogilive Duncan on July the 20th, 1930 in London to New Zealand parents. Now, something I did not know and I find most interesting was that Dr. Duncan was actually known by his second name, Ian, as apparently was the custom. So it's not Dr. George Duncan, as I always assumed, but he must have been Ian Duncan. So that was certainly a revelation to me. In 1933, the family returned to New Zealand. In 1937, they then moved to Victoria, here in Australia. He had a half-sister named Billy from his father Ronald's previous marriage. Circa 1950, Dr. Duncan developed tuberculosis, but he did not lose a lung. Now, I always read over the years that he had lost a lung because of a tuberculosis when he was younger, but apparently not the case. In January 1956, Dr. Duncan moves to Britain, and in 1957 he begins studying law at St. John's College in Cambridge, where he gains a doctorate, thus becomes Dr. Duncan. Between 1966 and 1971, he teaches law at the University of Bristol on I believe a part-time basis, and he's seeking full-time employment, and thus he applies for work at various universities, both in Britain and Australia. I'm just going to briefly show you, using Google Earth, the locations of Dr. Duncan's drowning in Adelaide, South Australia, in a relatively contained area of the city. So we'll start with the actual location of Dr. Duncan's drowning. Now, as you zoom into Adelaide, South Australia, let's pull this back a bit. So where can we say? Okay, so that's the River Torrens, runs through Adelaide. Over here is the Adelaide University. The site of Dr. Duncan's drowning is just at that's on the southern bank of the Torrens, in this area in here. This is Victoria Drive up here. Torrens Parade Ground is in here. These locations are explained in the video, so I'm just showing you on the map. The Adelaide University footbridge, that's over here. Now, where Dr. Duncan's residence was, at Lincoln College, cruise over, it's only a few kilometres from the River Torrens. So yeah, that's where Dr. Duncan was living at the time of his death, at Lincoln College. So see, it's a very close distance. If we can pan back and show you that. So yeah, there's Dr. Duncan lived here, and his drowning, just off screen, down here. So yeah, very short distance. Now, one other location I'll show you is the King's Head Hotel on King William Street, which is south of the city. That's it right there on King William Street. That's where the police farewell party took place, and where the alleged perpetrators of Dr. Duncan's death gathered that night before making their way allegedly to the River Torrens. We just show the location where everything is in relation. So yeah, King's Head Hotel down here, the police farewell party. Dr. Duncan's drowning a few kilometres north, and where he lived in that location there. So that's the Google Map locations for the Dr. Duncan drowning. There are three main suspects in the drowning of Dr. Duncan who would come to the fore. In fact, immediately after the drowning of Dr. Duncan, these three men were identified as the leading suspects. And these three are, in fact, they were all members, police officers of the Vice Squad at the time, and they were Constable Francis Corley, who was aged 24, Constable Michael Clayton, who was aged 25, and Constable Brian Hudson, who was aged 38 at the time of the drowning. Now, there's also been a lot of talk over the years about a mysterious fourth man in the company of these three suspects. But that fourth man has never been identified. So those are the three suspects in the drowning of Dr. Duncan.
This is the University of Adelaide. I'm on the Victoria Drive entrance, the northern side of the campus, and the university no more than a couple of 100 metres away from where Dr. Duncan would drown. Now, in August 1971, Dr. Duncan inquires about a position at the University of Adelaide, and in November 1971 he is offered a position as a law lecturer, which he accepts. So on March 25th, 1972, Dr. Duncan arrives here in Adelaide via boat trip from England, and just 2 days later, on March 27th, 1972, he begins working here at the university as a law lecturer, which of course is less than 2 months before Dr. Duncan would meet his tragic fate at the River Torrens on May the 10th, 1972. We're at number 45 Brome Place in North Adelaide at what is Lincoln College. Zoom in and prove there. Now, it was here that Dr. Duncan takes up residence here in North Adelaide, which is only about 1.5 kilometres from the spot he is drowning, from where he would drown, in a 2-bedroom flat. Now, a bit of history about Lincoln College. Lincoln College was established in 1952 by the Methodist Church of Australasia, and it was named after Lincoln College in Oxford, in England. And it was affiliated with the University of Adelaide. When Dr. Duncan first settled here, it was an all-male college. Women were eventually admitted in 1973. Now, Dr. Duncan, who was a gay man, learned about Adelaide's gay spots from an international gay travel guide called Spartacus, which was later found in his belongings after his death. And it listed outside cruising spaces in Adelaide for homosexuals. And one of the places that was listed was Victoria Drive, the number 1 beat, which, if I just pan my camera around, as I said, is about 1.5 kilometres from this location at Lincoln College in North Adelaide. I am at the King's Head Hotel at number 357 King William Street in Adelaide. This is a very old pub, established in 1876. At the moment it's closed, and some controversy raging about renovations not being done or something, but it also has a footnote in South Australian history, because it was here on the night of Wednesday, May the 10th, 1972, that a farewell party was being held for a police constable named Edward Mildenhall. At this farewell party were 3 vice squad officers: Constable Francis Cooley, age 24, Constable Michael Clayton, age 25, and Constable Brian Hudson, age 38. It is later alleged that it was here that they decided to travel down to the River Torrens, to the number 1 beat, to quote, flick poofters in, end quote, into the Torrens River. Now the 3 men admitted to leaving this hotel at 10:30 p.m. and drove north, which is in that direction, and from here they would end up at the River Torrens, about 2 kilometers away. I'm standing on the northern banks of the River Torrens, looking at the number 1 beat, which in 1972 and for many years afterwards is known as the number 1 beat, sort of the central gay meeting spot here in Adelaide, and where Dr. Duncan would meet his tragic fate. Now, you are facing in a southerly direction towards Victoria Drive. Now, as best as my understanding goes, the number 1 beat begins, that's the Adelaide Bridge on King William Road. That's Jolly's, well, it's Jolly's restaurant now. So the number 1 beat began around there and continued on the southern banks of the Torrens in a easterly direction all the way in this direction. Adelaide University over there, the Adelaide footbridge in the distance. See if we can zoom in on there. It's the Adelaide footbridge. Now the exact spot where Dr. Duncan drowned was in that vicinity there. So yeah, this is the number 1 beat, and you have to remember that when Dr. Duncan arrived here in 1972, homosexuality was illegal in Australia. It was a criminal offence. But where he'd come from, Britain, it was actually illegal or decriminalised. So, but I'm pretty sure Dr. Duncan understood that it was still illegal at the time in Adelaide. But that would bring him down here to the number 1 beat on the River Torrens. Wednesday night, May the 10th, 1972. Dr. Duncan parks his car on King William Road, which is in that direction west, about 100 metres from here, and makes his way to the River Torrens and to his fate. So it was in this spot here, along the southern banks of the River Torrens, that Dr. Duncan was thrown in. It was approximately a bit after 11 p.m. that Wednesday night. We do know that Dr. Duncan's watch stopped at 11:07 p.m, so one would assume that was the time he entered the river. When Dr. Duncan's body was retrieved the next morning, the autopsy confirmed he died from drowning and had grip bruises on both arms, as well as abrasions on his back, indicating he had been thrown into the river. So it was in this spot here now. Of course, you look at it now, it's a beautiful day, and you think, I mean, the River Torrens is, I'm not sure how deep it is, but you can understand how someone could drown. One minute you're standing here in the dark on a May night, which would have been a coldish night. It was typical of Adelaide. It was probably mild, 15 degrees Celsius perhaps, even at that time of night, but still. And then suddenly you're hurled into the Torrens, into the cold, dark waters, and you can understand why someone would panic and drown. Now, just a side note, an incredible aspect of Dr. Duncan's drowning was that When he was retrieved out of the Torrens on the next morning, May 11th, by the police diving squad, he was brought up here to the banks, and the news media were slow on the game, and they missed seeing Dr. Duncan's body being retrieved from the river here. So with true callousness and disregard for a man's life, the police diving squad actually put Dr. Duncan's body back into the Torrens so they could retrieve him for the cameras. Just one in a long line of indignities on Dr. Duncan, who drowned right here on the River Torrens. On that night, Dr. Duncan was not the only victim to be thrown into the Torrens. The second man, 27-year-old Roger Wesley James, also was thrown into the River Torrens, though of course he would survive. Now, he was sitting on a bench at the time, which I think it's this one here. Now remember, this is 51 years ago, so I'm sure things have changed, but in this, around this approximation was where James sat. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but here on the southern banks of the Torrens, we're on a lower level than Victoria Drive, which is just up there, so it's slightly set back here. Anyway, so Roger James said he was sitting on a bench that night when he was approached by a man who asked him twice, quote, "Do you give it or take it?" end quote. James replied, quote, "Neither," end quote, suspecting that he was being set up. As he would later say, it didn't seem like a normal approach that would be made on the beats. He then saw a group of men attacking Dr. Duncan and push him into the Torrens, which I said was right in this area here. James was somewhat vague about how many men pushed Dr. Duncan into the Torrens, though you have to remember that James was very tight-lipped in the years to come after the attack, fearing retribution, and he made some ambiguous statements, and other statements he was very tight-lipped on. But after they pushed Dr. Duncan into the river, James said they then turned on him, punching him in the head, and pushed him into the Torrens. And in the process, James broke his ankle. James, while in the river, said he saw Dr. Duncan, as he described, silently disappear underneath the waters. James yelled out that the man, Dr. Duncan, was drowning. James tried to crawl out of the river, but was pushed back in. And when Dr. Duncan did not emerge from underneath the water, one of the attackers actually stripped off to his underwear and jumped in to try to retrieve Dr. Duncan, but was unable to in the dark waters. And at that point, the attackers fled the scene. Now, Roger James said that on the night he was attacked, May the 10th, 1972, he was just walking home and decided to take a bit of a break here at the Torrens, and was just resting on the benches. That he was here for no other reason. Again, you have to remember, in 1972, it was illegal to indulge in homosexual acts here in Australia, though prosecutors would give immunity later on. But the question arises, did Dr. Duncan and Roger James know each other? Because a man named Bobby Callahan later said he saw James and Duncan drinking together at the Buckingham Arms Hotel, which is about 3 kilometres from this location in Gilberton to the east. But whether Dr. Duncan or Roger James knew each other, and whatever James was doing here that night is, I think, really irrelevant. The fact that is, they were attacked and violently thrown into the Torrens. So this is where the story takes a most ironic turn. Now, Roger James, with a broken ankle, drags himself out of the Torrens and pulls him up to the banks here on Victoria Drive. He manages to crawl his way up here to Victoria Drive. This location right here, somewhere on this road here. Right in front of the Torrens parade ground. So James manages to flag down a Good Samaritan who does stop the car and drives Roger James the short distance to the nearby Royal Adelaide Hospital, well, now the old Royal Adelaide Hospital on North Terrace, which is only, less than a kilometre from here in that direction, just around the corner from Frome Road. But the Good Samaritan turns out to be none other than Bevan Spencer von Einem, a future, of course, Adelaide serial killer who had gone to murder 5 young men between 1979 and 1983. But on this particular night, 25-year-old von Einem did the good thing and drove James to the hospital. Now, what von Einem was doing here that night is anyone's guess. He claimed he was just dropping something off from work, even though it was 11 at night, and was just happened to be innocently driving by, but I think it's most likely that he was at the beat doing whatever he was doing, and who knows what he saw that night. He may have seen the police, or the alleged police allegedly throw Dr. Duncan into the river. But so yeah, that was von Einem, the Good Samaritan, who saved Roger James right here on Victoria Drive. Another witness that night was Kevin Williamson, who'd been attending an event at the Torrens Parade Ground, which is right there, here on Victoria Drive. Now, when he left the event that Wednesday night, he walked across Victoria Drive, and he said he sat down on a bench to have a smoke. Now, exactly what bench Mr. Williams is referring to, I'm not exactly sure. Let's just say, for argument's sake, that the bench was around here, where Kevin Williamson sat. He said he saw 4 men run past on the lower path. So when he describes the lower path, let me see if I can show you that, what he means by the lower path. So as I said, this area is elevated, and there's a lower path there that runs a path along the Torrens. So Kevin Williamson sitting on his bench, after he saw the 4 men run past, one man approached him and told him, quote, "Best get out of here. The coppers will be here shortly," end quote. Williamson ignored this, thinking, who's this guy think he is? But another man approached him and was much more aggressive in his demands that Williamson leave the area. So Kevin Williamson decided he'd better do that. He got up and he returned to his car, which, as we said, was parked over here on Victoria Drive, over there. Now, when he was in his car, Williamson said he saw 4 men cross Victoria Drive. That's where you're looking at. At the inquest, Williamson said he couldn't identify the men, but he told the New Scotland Yard detectives later that year that he did in fact recognise 2 of the men as Brian Hudson and Michael Clayton. 3 more witnesses that night were 3 gay men, and their names are still suppressed to this day, and they were given immunity from the South Australian government of the day to testify to what they saw. Now, they said they were sitting in a car here on Victoria Drive, and they saw a group of men running around the boat sheds. So the boat sheds would be over here. It used to be anyway, I'm not sure if they're still there, but in that general direction there is where the boat sheds were. So they said they saw this group of men running around, and one of the men running around was identified as Francis Cooley. The next witness is known only as Mr. X, who would testify at the inquest. Now, he said 30 minutes before Dr. Duncan drowned, which would be about around 10:30 p.m. that night, May the 10th, 1972, Mr. X said he entered the toilet block here beside King William Road. Now again, whether this is the exact location it was in 72, I think it probably was. Certainly would have probably been renovated, but it was definitely in this general location. Mr. X said he entered the toilet block here. Better be careful myself here. Yeah, so Mr. X said he entered the toilet block and he spoke to a man. Mr. X then said he left the toilet block, returned to his car and began to drive east along Victoria Drive, where the story continues. So Mr. X is driving east along Victoria Drive when he spots the same man whom he'd encountered in the toilet walking along Victoria Drive. So Mr. X pulls the car over, parks the car around here and gets out, and he begins to follow this man to the same spot, to the same spot where Dr. Duncan and Roger James would later be thrown into the river at these very steps. So Mr. X was on the steps here, and a second man appeared, and Mr. X is attacked by both men, and he's actually thrown down these very steps by these two individuals. There's quite a steep staircase leading down to the Torrens. So the two individuals attack Mr. X and push him all the way down the stairs, and Mr. X is also thrown into the Torrens. As I said, this is about half an hour before Duncan and James are thrown in. Now Mr. X did say he noticed a third man lurking in the shadows of a tree. Could have been that tree here, so I guess Mr. X was thrown in here somewhere. After they threw him in the river, the three individuals walked off west, and Mr. X was able to extricate himself from the river and survive. Now Mr. X said he thinks one of the men was Francis Cooley, but he couldn't be positive about that. Now, an interesting side note to the Mr. X case is that when Mr. X testified at the inquest a month after Dr. Duncan's drowning, he was represented by none other than Darren Stevenson, who was a bit of a famous lawyer in Adelaide in the 70s. Of course, Stevenson himself, the lawyer, would end up being murdered himself on June the 4th, 1979, in the infamous body in the freezer case. So that is just an interesting footnote in a case which has a lot of ironies to it. But yeah, that was the attack on Mr. X. A third man attacked that night. Two witnesses that night were in fact two police officers, Constables Daryl Smedley and Martin Maynard, who were on duty that night in their marked police car, which was situated around here on Victoria Drive near King William Road. Now they were sitting here in their patrol car between 10:20 and 10:30 p.m. As they sat in their patrol car, none other than Francis Cooley appears at their car, and he says to them, quote, "Would you mind taking a drive? You're buggering up our poofters on the river," end quote. The two constables complied and drove off, and they last saw Francis Cooley walking off towards the toilet block, which is right there. Certainly as today, would have been around that location in 72. So here you have Francis Cooley allegedly telling two patrolmen to buzz off, that they were interrupting. Obviously, I guess Cooley referred to the fact that if they were here policing any homosexual activity on the Torrens, and if a patrol car was sitting out here in the open, it would obviously frighten away potential individuals. So that happened right here on Victoria Drive. Now on King William Road and the Adelaide Bridge, which runs over the River Torrens. Now on the night of May the 10th, 1972, a police officer named Constable Ronald Harris was on duty at the River Torrens police station, very close by here. He'd attended some business in this area, and he began walking down these steps. As he walked down, do this carefully, as he walked down these steps, Constable Harris ran into none other than Francis Cooley, who was coming up the stairs. So Harris was going down, Cooley was going up. So Cooley was going in that direction, and Harris was walking down the stairs. Now Constable Harris also saw a second man at the base of these stairs, but couldn't identify him. Harris greeted Cooley with "Good day, John," which was John was Francis Cooley's middle name. I guess he was known by that. And Cooley replied, and I quote, "Fuck off," end quote. Anxious, and it was in an anxious tone, not an angry tone, but an anxious tone, as if Cooley wanted Constable Harris to not disturb whatever he was up to down here at the Torrens. So these steps, as we see, lead into the southern bank of the River Torrens. Jolly's Boathouse, now Jolly's Restaurant, here at the River Torrens. Of course, Dr. Duncan is not forgotten here in Adelaide. His tragic murder would be a catalyst for dramatic legal reforms here in Adelaide, and at the site near his drowning there is a couple of nice markers. This one here is so we're about, Dr. Duncan drowned about maybe 100 metres from here. We're near the University footbridge. This sign was erected on July 20th, 2020. It's a tongue twister. Which was the 90th anniversary of Dr. Duncan's death. As you see, this gives some information about the drowning, as well as the law reform that was to follow. Includes the famous news headline. So yeah, that's right near the University footbridge. And there's another marker which was placed, I believe, on the 40th anniversary. In fact, it might have been the 30th anniversary, actually. Yes, it would have been. This was placed on the 30th anniversary of Dr. Duncan's death in May 2002. And this one is a bit harder to read. The sun here, just see what it says. It says, "In memory of Dr. George Duncan, whose death by drowning on May 10th, 1972, near here at the hands of persons unconvicted, precipitated homosexual law reform, making it the first state in Australia in 1975 to decriminalise homosexual relations between consenting adults. we will remember him. Yeah, as I said, placed here on the 30th anniversary. So both the memorials to Dr. Duncan are here on Victoria Drive, across from the university, and right near the university footbridge. As I said, about 100 metres from where Dr. Duncan drowned.
On June the 7th, 1972, which was just under a month after Dr. Duncan's drowning, an inquest opens into the death, led by the city coroner, Tom Cleland, and based in Weymouth Street, in the heart of Adelaide. On June the 29th, 1972, Michael Clayton and Francis Cooley both take the stand in the inquest, but both refuse to answer questions on the grounds that it may incriminate them. The following day, June 30th, 1972, Brian Hudson takes the stand, and he also refuses to answer. In response, all three police officers are suspended, as their refusal to answer reflects badly on the police, which is the official line of the South Australian Police. On that very same day that they are suspended, Brian Hudson resigns from the police force. On July 13th, 1972, both Michael Clayton and Francis Cooley also resign from the South Australian Police. On July the 5th, 1972, the inquest concludes, and the verdict is that Dr. Duncan's cause of death was drowning by violence by persons unknown. After the inquest fails to find anyone responsible for the drowning of Dr. Duncan, as well as the attacks on Roger James and Mr. X, there are of course rumours swirling around that the South Australian Police Force and the government have covered it up. In response to this, on July the 27th, 1972, a mere 22 days after the inquest ends, the South Australian government announces that New Scotland Yard will investigate the drowning. I guess the idea there was to have an independent investigation look into the death. On August the 5th, 1972, two New Scotland Yard detectives arrive in Adelaide to investigate. They are 50-year-old Detective Chief Superintendent Bob McGowan and 35-year-old Detective Sergeant Charles O'Hanlon, and together with the Adelaide CIB, the Criminal Investigation Bureau, they begin to investigate the drowning of Dr. Duncan. On October the 2nd, 1972, after concluding their investigation, the New Scotland Yard detectives give their report to the South Australian Police. But this report is withheld from all the public for the next 29 years, giving rise to many rumours and speculations about what the report contains. Eventually, on July the 15th, 2002, 29 years later, the New Scotland Yard report is tabled in the South Australian Parliament. There's no great revelations in the report, but the gist of the report is that Francis Cooley, Brian Hudson and Michael Clayton had lied to South Australian Police and were most likely guilty. After the New Scotland Yard investigation in 1972, the case goes quiet for the next, the next 12 years. But in mid-1985, suddenly the case is once again blown wide open by a whistleblower named Mick O'Shea, who was an ex-Vice Squad police officer at the time. At the time that Dr. Duncan drowned, Mick O'Shea was 23 years old and had been in the Vice Squad 18 months. He was at the farewell party held at the King's Head Hotel on the night of May the 10th, 1972. In 1981, O'Shea suffers a nervous breakdown and leaves the police force on a disability pension. In 1985, he gives his story to the Adelaide Advertiser, our local newspaper here, and reporter Mike McEwen. McEwen would actually later win the Walkley Award for Excellence in Journalism for this series of articles. though Mick O'Shea would become embittered at McEwen, accusing the reporter of using him and sensationalising the story. Nonetheless, the story does its job. On July the 30th, 1985, the Advertiser begins printing a series of articles of Mick O'Shea's allegations, and they are explosive. The basic summation of Mick O'Shea's allegations are that forensic evidence was ignored by the police that could implicate police officers in the drowning of Dr. Duncan, that the fourth man was known but never interviewed by the South Australian Police or New Scotland Yard, that it was standard procedure for the Vice Squad to terrorise homosexuals at the River Torrens, and it was a routine practice to throw them into the river. That on May the 10th, 1972, at the party at the King's Head Hotel, there was talk among police officers about going to the Torrens and, quote, flicking poofters in, end quote. That evidence at the inquest was suppressed by senior police officers in South Australia, and at the time of the drowning in 1972 there was a general level of corruption in the Vice Squad and divisions between senior and junior police officers. These, of course, were the explosive allegations made by Mick O'Shea. Now, Mick O'Shea also denied that he was this mysterious fourth man, but he did say he knew who was the fourth man, explaining that the man was an organiser at the King's Head Hotel and had attended the farewell party, though Mick O'Shea then later retracted his statement, saying that he knew who the fourth man was. In the wake of these allegations, reporter Mike McEwen interviewed Brian Hudson in Perth, where he was then living. Hudson denied involvement in the drowning of Dr. Duncan, but he did admit that the Vice Squad at the time had corrupt elements and that they did throw homosexuals into the Torrens. In the wake of these dramatic allegations by Mick O'Shea made in the Adelaide Advertiser, on August the 1st, 1985, the South Australian government, which at the time was the Labor government of John Bannon, the Attorney General Chris Sumner announces that a task force is being established to investigate O'Shea's allegations. On January the 10th, 1986, the task force submits its report to the Crown Prosecutor Paul Rice. On February the 5th, 1986, Francis Cooley, Michael Clayton and Brian Hudson are charged with the manslaughter of Dr. Duncan, and Brian Hudson is extradited from Western Australia, whereas Clayton and Cooley are both living here in South Australia still. On September the 8th, 1986, the preliminary hearing begins under the Chief Magistrate Nick Manos here in Adelaide. On October the 29th, 1986, the manslaughter charge against Brian Hudson is dismissed, so Hudson walks a free man. But for his two co-charged, not so lucky. On November the 12th, 1986, both Francis Cooley and Michael Clayton are committed to stand trial for the manslaughter of Dr. Duncan. But it takes almost 2 years for the trial to get underway. On September the 13th, 1988, the trial of Francis Cooley and Michael Clayton begins, with both men pleading not guilty. And on September the 30th, 1988, the trial dramatically ends with both Francis Cooley and Michael Clayton acquitted of the drowning and manslaughter of Dr. Duncan. And to this day, as I say this, in January 2025, no one else has ever been charged, let alone convicted, for the drowning murder of Dr. Duncan. The drowning murder of Dr. Duncan would be a catalyst for dramatic reform regarding gay laws in not just South Australia but all of Australia. Now, the process to decriminalise homosexuality in South Australia was a period of about 3 years following Dr. Duncan's murder. Now, it's a long and convoluted process with a lot of bills introduced, reintroduced, amended, etc., before finally succeeding. Now, I'm not going to go into every intricacy of that process, but if you're interested in that, as I said, the book I mentioned earlier, The Death of Dr. Duncan by Tim Reeves, goes into more detail, and I'm sure there's other resources out there that goes into far more detail. I'll just give a brief summation of that process. Now, on July the 26th, 1972, which is just a couple of months after Dr. Duncan's death, the Liberal MP Murray Hill introduces a private member's bill to the South Australian Parliament to decriminalise homosexuality. On November the 9th, 1972, that bill is passed, but it's amended and watered down. There's a whole lot of things that have happened in the interim. Then on September the 19th, 1973, the Labor MP Peter Duncan reintroduces a new bill. And again, there's a bit of a torturous process. But eventually, about 2 years later, almost 2 years later, on September the 17th, 1975, the bill is passed in full. And on September the 25th, 1975, that bill becomes law, basically decriminalising homosexuality in South Australia. And eventually, all of Australia follows. South Australia was the first state to decriminalise homosexuality, with the rest of the country following. And all of that from the fallout of the tragic drowning murder of Dr. Duncan, who was by all accounts a very modest and private man, and he would have been, never for a moment would he have dreamed that he himself would be the catalyst for, well, dramatic reform.
Welcome to Centennial Park in Pasadena, a southern suburb of Adelaide, here on Goodwood Road. We're about 8 kilometres or so from Adelaide, and we're here to pay our respects and visit the grave of Dr. George Duncan. Or should I say, Dr. Ian Duncan. We walk into Centennial Park. So Dr. Duncan's grave is in the Acacia E section of Centennial Park in row number 34, as you can see here, and his grave is not that far from the road. Here it is, right here. The final resting place of Dr. Ian Duncan. There it is. People have put flowers in there. George Ian Ogilive Duncan, born July 20th, 1930, endowed with modesty and scholarship, died May 10th, 1972. Like the man himself, a modest headstone. So yeah, this is the final resting place of Dr. Duncan in Centennial Park here in Adelaide. As I said, in Acacia E section, row 34. If anyone wants to pay their respects, but this is where it is right here. So, yep, the final resting place of Dr. Duncan. Rest in peace, Dr. Duncan.